In this lesson, we'll be precomposing 3D layers and using collapse transformations. In our composition, we have several 3D layers, and so our layers panel is getting really full. And so one thing that we can do is precompose some of these layers to help organize our timeline in our layers panel. And so we're going to grab our boy, our man, and our woman. And so I'm just hitting Shift and selecting these, and we're going to go up to Layer, and we're going to pre-compose. And so what that's going to do is create a nested composition inside our comp. So we'll call this composition people. And we're going to move all of our attributes into the new composition. So let's hit OK. All right. So the first thing that you might have noticed is that now our people are hiding behind this ground layer. So what has happened is that After Effects has taken a snapshot of those 3D layers that we have selected to put inside this comp, and it has just placed them inside of our 3D composition. So if I were to turn this pre-comp into a 3D layer, then now that pre-comp is accepting light, and it has now placed that in relationship to the rest of the layers on top of the ground layer. Now, you might have think that you've just solved this problem, but really, this is still just a flat image of those 3D objects. And so, to give you a better idea of what has happened, let's go into our different 3D view, and let's change our view to Custom View 1. And we're going to grab our unified camera and just wheel that around. And so, do you remember how we had depth before between our characters? And now, it's just that flat snapshot of those 3D layers. And so let's go back to our active camera. What we can do to now make After Effects look at all of our layers and not just a snapshot of this pre-comp is that we can pre-compose, or that we can collapse our transformations for our pre-composition. So that is this column right here that you see that looks like a sun or a star. So if I select that layer and I collapse the transformations for it, now After Effects is now rendering all of the layers in my comp, even the ones inside of that pre-comp, all at once. Whereas before, After Effects was just going through and rendering, and then it was grabbing this layer and just getting a snapshot and then moving on to the next. And so now it is actually looking inside that pre-composition and rendering all of those layers. And so now we have that interaction between our 3D objects that are inside that pre-comp, and it's now casting shadows. And so now if we go to our active camera or our custom view 1 and we pan around, now you can see that we have our depth back. And so it's very, very handy that you do that. And so let's go back to our active camera. So there are some things that you need to keep in mind when using collapse transformations for your pre-comps, is that if you wanted to mask any of these features, so if we were to grab our shape layer and we are going to, with our people pre-comp selected, let's say we just wanted to mask our child or our boy over here. And so we have already broken that effect. And so you won't be able to collapse your transformations and add a mask to that pre-comp. However, I'm going to delete that mask. If you do want to mask anything, then you need to go inside of that pre-comp. And then if we wanted to mask our boy, then we could do that. And so now if we go back to our part composition, so now we have this floating mask of this boy, but it's still 3D and it's still interacting with our 3D space. And so the same rule applies for adding any kind of effect to our pre-comp. So I have our collapse transformations on, and so I'm just going to go to our effects and presets, and I'm going to add a blur. So I'll just pick one of these. I'll pick the Gaussian blur, and we'll just double click on that. Same thing happens, and I haven't even added any blurriness to this pre-comp, and we already have lost our ability to interact with our background layers and everything. So what you'll need to do is, well, first we'll just delete that effect, but we need to go inside of our pre-comp. And then if we wanted to add a blur, then we'd have to blur each layer individually. And so if I blurred my boy, or we're going to blur our man, then if we go back to our original composition, then we can see that we have that effect, but we haven't broken that relationship between our 3D objects. So very, very important to keep that in mind. So you can still keep your layers organized and you can pre-compose your layers. Just remember that you need to click this collapse transformation. And one thing I should mention is that when we turn this 3D on, it doesn't really have any relevance to this pre-comp once we've turned on that collapse transformation. So, all right, now that is our pre-composing 3D layers and collapse transformation. And in our next lesson, we'll be creating 3D cameras and using the unified camera tool to move our cameras around.